Picture this: a world where entire cities lie silent, streets empty except for the rattle of death carts collecting the fallen, the air thick with the scent of decay, desperate prayers echoing through abandoned homes. This was the reality of Europe in the mid-1300s, when the Black Death swept across the continent, wiping out nearly half its population in just a few horrifying years. Historians call it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, a tragedy so vast it reshaped societies, economies, and even faith itself. But what if there's more to this story than meets the eye? What if the plague's unimaginable devastation wasn't just a twist of fate but a carefully constructed smokescreen? Could the Black Death have been a cover-up for something far more sinister? For centuries, we've accepted the official narrative, a vicious bacterium, Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats, spreading death with ruthless efficiency. But dig a little deeper and unsettling questions emerge. Why did some communities escape unscathed while others were obliterated, even when they shared the same conditions? Why do certain accounts from the time describe symptoms that don't quite match the classic signs of bubonic plague? And perhaps most chilling of all, why were there whispers, even then, of something unnatural at work? Some medieval texts hint at darker forces, of strange lights in the sky, mysterious powders scattered in the streets, and sudden illnesses that defied all known medicine. Were these just the superstitious ramblings of a terrified populace, or clues to a truth that's been buried for centuries? Tonight, we're pulling back the veil on one of history's greatest mysteries. We'll traverse forgotten archives, decode cryptic manuscripts, and follow the trail of anomalies that challenge everything we thought we knew about the Black Death. This isn't just a story about a pandemic, it's a journey into the shadows of power, secrecy, and the length some might go to rewrite history itself. So steel yourself, because what you're about to hear might change the way you see the past forever. The question isn't just what caused the Black Death, but who might have benefited from its chaos, and the answers, well, they're not for the faint of heart. The Black Death didn't just arrive, it exploded. Beginning in the 1340s, this merciless wave of death surged from the trade routes of Central Asia, carried by ships and caravans into the heart of Europe. Within a decade, it had claimed between 25 and 50 million lives, nearly half the continent's population. Imagine entire villages vanishing overnight, families wiped out before they could even bury their dead. The symptoms were grotesquely unmistakable: swollen, blackened lymph nodes called buboes, raging fevers, and dark splotches spreading across the skin as internal bleeding ravaged the body. Victims often died within days, sometimes hours, leaving no time for goodbyes or last rites. But the plague was more than just a medical catastrophe, it was a social earthquake. Labor shortages gave surviving peasants unexpected bargaining power, fracturing the rigid feudal system. Churches, unable to explain or stop the suffering, saw their authority crumble as people turned to mysticism, desperate for answers. Art and literature darkened, obsessed with themes of mortality. Think of the eerie dances of death painted on chapel walls, skeletons leading the living to their graves. Yet beneath this well-documented chaos, strange inconsistencies linger. Why did some regions, like modern-day Poland, remain almost untouched despite sharing trade routes with devastated neighbors? Why do some historical accounts mention symptoms like rapid organ failure or bleeding from the ears, details that don't align with typical bubonic plague? And why, in the midst of this horror, were there sudden, unexplained fires in cities like London, destroying records that might have told us more? The Black Death didn't just leave corpses in its wake, it left questions. Questions that, 7 centuries later, still whisper of secrets buried beneath the official story. One of the most baffling mysteries of the Black Death isn't just how fast it spread, but where it didn't. Take medieval Poland, a kingdom surrounded by devastation, yet mysteriously left almost untouched. Neighboring regions like Germany and Bohemia were drowning in corpses, yet Polish chronicles record barely a whisper of the plague. How could that be? If rats and fleas were the sole culprits, why didn't they cross those borders? Some historians point to Poland's scattered settlements and strict quarantine measures, but even then, the disparity is staggering. Other pockets of resistance pop up across Europe: isolated monasteries, remote mountain villages, all surviving against impossible odds. Then there's the opposite phenomenon: sudden, violent outbreaks in places that should have been safe. In the small Norwegian village of Bergen, the plague appeared after winter had frozen the ports, when rats and fleas should have been dormant. Eyewitnesses described entire households collapsing within days, as if the sickness had been dropped among them. Similar stories emerge from inland towns far from trade routes, where ships and rats couldn't possibly have carried the disease. And here's where things get eerie. Traditional bubonic plague follows predictable patterns: slow buildup, seasonal peaks, and clear links to rat infestations. But the Black Death behaved almost deliberately. It flared in winter, defying biology. It skipped over some cities while annihilating others just miles away. Some victims showed signs of rapid, almost chemical poisoning: violent spasms, blackened skin, bleeding from the eyes, symptoms medieval doctors noted as unlike any natural pestilence. This isn't just academic curiosity. These gaps in the official story have fueled whispers for centuries. Manuscripts from the time speak of strange mists settling over towns before death followed. Others blame poisoned winds or even falling stars. The most chilling accounts come from Italy, where physicians reported finding unmarked barrels of fine powder in streets where the plague first erupted. Were these just the desperate theories of a pre-scientific world, or fragments of a truth someone wanted buried? When you stitch these anomalies together, a disturbing picture emerges: a catastrophe that doesn't quite fit nature's design. And when nature falls short, human hands just might step in. If rats were truly the silent architects of the Black Death's carnage, we'd expect their bones to litter the archaeological record like grim confetti. Yet here's the catch: dig up the soil of Europe's hardest-hit cities, and you'll often find something startlingly absent: rat remains. While historians long blamed the common black rat for ferrying plague-infected fleas, the physical evidence tells a patchier story. Take London, a city synonymous with medieval filth and infestations. Excavations of plague pits from the 1300s reveal shockingly few rat skeletons compared to the staggering human toll. The same pattern repeats in Marseille, where ships supposedly teeming with diseased rodents left behind curiously little proof in the harborside graves. This isn't just a case of fragile bones decaying over time. Researchers have found intact human remains alongside personal effects in these very sites, preserved well enough to study. So where are the rats? Some outbreaks, like the brutal wave that hit Iceland in 1400, occurred in regions so cold and isolated that rat populations couldn't have thrived at all. Even in warmer climates, the plague's lightning spread defies rodent behavior. Rats are slow travelers, typically sticking to a few hundred meters around their nest. Yet the Black Death raced across continents faster than a galloping horse, outpacing any natural rat migration by years. This glaring gap in the evidence has led scientists to reconsider the classic flea and rat model. Could human fleas or lice have hijacked the disease, spreading it person to person like a medieval superspreader event? Some genetic studies suggest Yersinia pestis adapted to survive in these parasites, turning every crowded market or pilgrim's cloak into a potential death trap. But even that theory stumbles when faced with accounts of lone farmsteads miles from any neighbor succumbing overnight. Then there's the elephant in the room: intentional spread. Eyewitnesses from Milan to Kiev reported mysterious figures smearing poisonous ointments on door handles or dumping suspicious powders into wells right before outbreaks began. Contemporary courts executed dozens for these alleged crimes. The though modern historians often dismiss the trials as panic-driven witch hunts. But what if some of these accusations held a grain of truth? In 2012, researchers re-examining letters between Italian city-states found coded references to Venetian gifts, barrels of grain delivered to rival cities shortly before plague erupted. Grain shipments, of course, would have been the perfect Trojan horse for infected fleas or something far more deliberate. The unsettling possibility lingers. In the chaos of the 14th century, someone may have realized that terror, like disease, could be weaponized. And the perfect cover for such an atrocity, a tragedy so vast no one would think to look for human hands behind it. The traditional explanation pins the Black Death squarely on Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind bubonic plague. But a growing chorus of researchers argues this story doesn't quite add up. When you compare medieval accounts to modern outbreaks of bubonic plague, glaring inconsistencies emerge. Take the speed of death. In typical cases, bubonic plague takes days or even weeks to kill, giving victims time to develop the telltale buboes. Yet chroniclers of the Black Death described people waking up healthy and dropping dead by sunset, their bodies sometimes marked not by swollen lymph nodes, but by violent hemorrhaging, blood pouring from noses, ears, even the pores of their skin. These aren't the hallmarks of a flea-borne illness. They're the terrifying signatures of something far more virulent. Could the Black Death have actually been a hemorrhagic virus like a medieval strain of Ebola? The parallels are chilling. Both diseases cause catastrophic internal bleeding, rapid organ failure, and swift mortality. Eyewitness accounts from the 1300s describe victims coughing up blood, their urine turning black, hallmark symptoms of viral hemorrhagic fevers. Even the patterns of transmission match eerily. While bubonic plague relies on flea vectors, hemorrhagic viruses spread directly between people through bodily fluids, which would explain how the Black Death ripped through isolated communities with no rats in sight. One Norwegian chronicle tells of a ship drifting into port with every crew member dead, their corpses melting from within, a scene straight out of a modern biohazard nightmare. Then there's the anthrax theory. Some historians point to accounts of livestock dying en masse alongside humans, a phenomenon bubonic plague doesn't explain since it primarily targets rodents. Anthrax, though, thrives in both animals and people. It can linger in soil for decades, suddenly resurfacing to infect those who disturb it. Medieval farmers tilling fields or burying dead animals could have unwittingly unleashed spores, triggering outbreaks that burned through villages like wildfire. And anthrax poisoning aligns with another bizarre detail. Reports of victims' skin turning coal-black post-mortem, a condition called black jaundice that mirrors anthrax's necrotic effects. Genetic evidence adds fuel to the fire. While traces of Yersinia pestis have been found in some plague victims, not all graves yield the bacterium, and even when present, it's often alongside other pathogens. A 2018 study of mass burial sites in Europe revealed shocking diversity in the microbial remains, including anthrax and tuberculosis DNA. Could the Black Death have been a perfect storm of multiple diseases, with Yersinia pestis merely the most visible player? Or was something else entirely at work, a pathogen lost to history, one that left echoes in the terrified scribbles of medieval monks who wrote of a sickness no physician could name? The implications are staggering. If the Black Death wasn't purely bubonic plague, our understanding of its spread and our preparedness for future pandemics might rest on flawed assumptions. Modern antibiotics can treat Yersinia pestis, but a hemorrhagic virus or weaponized anthrax would demand entirely different defenses. Perhaps that's why this debate matters beyond academic curiosity. Unraveling the true nature of the Black Death isn't just about rewriting history, it's about decoding a warning from the past, one that still whispers to us across the centuries. History is littered with moments where the powerful reshape truth to suit their needs, sometimes with consequences as deadly as any plague. Consider the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, where for 40 years the Government withheld treatment from hundreds of black men, letting them suffer and die to study the disease's progression. Or the infamous British cover-up during the Irish potato famine, when officials downplayed starvation while exporting grain from a starving nation. Even the 1986 Chernobyl disaster saw Soviet authorities initially silence reports, sacrificing lives to preserve an illusion of control. These weren't just lies, they were systemic erasures, proof that institutions will often prioritize power over people when chaos strikes. Could medieval rulers have done the same? The Black Death arrived at a time of unprecedented upheaval. Kingdoms fractured, the church's authority wavered, and peasant revolts simmered. For those in power, assigning blame to God's wrath or miasmic heirs was far safer than admitting they had no answers, or worse, that someone among them might have engineered the crisis. Venetian magistrates, for instance, enforced brutal quarantines while secretly profiting from the panic, buying abandoned estates for pennies. In France, rumors swirled that the nobility poisoned wells to thin out rebellious populations, accusations so widespread they sparked pogroms against Jewish communities, conveniently diverting anger from the ruling class. Then there's the curious case of Milan. While most Italian cities lost half their citizens, Milan's death toll stayed suspiciously low, allegedly thanks to the Visconti family's draconian measures. But dig deeper and you'll find records of night wagons removing bodies before dawn, and whispers of the family paying physicians to falsify death records. Was it genuine containment or a carefully staged illusion to project strength? Even the church played its part. Papal decrees labeled plague skeptics as heretics, ensuring few dared question the official narrative. The eeriest parallel lies in the lost knowledge. When the Library of Alexandria burned, it wasn't just books that vanished, it was entire sciences. The Black Death triggered a similar purge. Monastic healers who documented unconventional treatments like the use of silver to ward off infection were silenced as devil's alchemists. Arab physicians whose germ theory predated Western medicine by centuries saw their texts banned or destroyed. By the time the plague receded, only one version of events remained, the one approved by those left standing. The question isn't just whether medieval powers lied, it's what they stood to gain. Land grabs, political purges, the crushing of dissent, all flourished in the plague's shadow. And if history teaches us anything, it's that the victors don't just write history, they sanitize it. So when we read accounts of the Black Death, we're not seeing the full picture, we're seeing the story that survived, and that perhaps is the most chilling cover-up of all. Amid the chaos of the Black Death, one group emerged with startling advantages, those already in power. While peasants and merchants dropped dead by the thousands, the church and crown seized opportunities hidden beneath the carnage. Consider the sudden windfall of land deals, with entire families wiped out, their estates reverted to feudal lords or the church by default. In England, records show monasteries doubling their holdings in just 5 years, snapping up orphaned properties for a fraction of their worth. The Archbishop of Canterbury alone amassed over 200 estates between 1348 and 1350, a land grab disguised as divine providence. Quarantine laws, often touted as early public health measures, carried a darker political edge. Venice's famed 40-day isolation, the origin of the word quarantine, was enforced by armed guards who burned homes with the sick inside. But dig into city ledgers and you'll find these guards were paid not by health officials, but by merchant oligarchs who conveniently gained control of the deceased's trade routes. In France, King Philip VI used plague edicts to silence rebellious towns, declaring any resistance to his rule a miasmatic danger requiring military suppression. Meanwhile, the papacy leveraged the crisis to tighten doctrinal control, branding folk healers as witches and mandating paid indulgences for spiritual protection. The most chilling power play came through selective enforcement. While peasants faced brutal lockdowns, nobles often flouted the rules with impunity. When the Duke of Milan's son fell ill, physicians were smuggled in under cloak of darkness, the same physicians who denounced commoners for seeking unauthorized treatments. In Spain, Jewish communities were forcibly quarantined in plague-stricken districts while Christian leaders fled to fortified country estates. These weren't just health measures, they were social weapons, reforging hierarchies under the guise of emergency. Perhaps the starkest evidence lies in what followed the plague's retreat. The labor shortage should have empowered surviving workers, but new laws like England's Statute of Labourers froze wages at pre-plague levels. The church launched witch hunt trials targeting independent-minded women who'd nursed the sick using herbal remedies, erasing competition to their medical monopoly. Even the art of the period tells a telling story where once plague paintings showed collective suffering. Post-plague works depicted kings and bishops bathed in heavenly light, their authority divinely reaffirmed. The pattern is undeniable. At every turn, the powerful turned biological catastrophe into political theater. Whether through land seizures, manipulated quarantines, or manufactured piety, they ensured the Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed dissent. And in the ashes of that silence, new empires rose. When the Black Death swept through Europe, fear wasn't the only thing that spread. Violence followed in its wake. Jewish communities, leper colonies, and foreign travelers became targets of horrific pogroms, blamed for poisoning wells or spreading cursed mists. These accusations didn't emerge from thin air. They were carefully stoked by those in power, turning panic into a weapon. In Strasbourg, nearly 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a single day in 1349. Their wealth confiscated by local officials who just weeks earlier owed them substantial debts. Records show city councils cancelling loans to Jewish moneylenders by labeling them plague conspirators, a convenient way to erase financial obligations while diverting public fury. Lepers faced a similar fate. Long ostracized for their illness, they now became scapegoats for the pandemic. In France, entire leper hospitals were torched, their inhabitants accused of brewing poisonous ointments from toads and herbs. Yet the timing of these attacks raises uncomfortable questions. Many pogroms erupted before the plague even reached a region, suggesting the accusations weren't reactions to disease but planned campaigns. A letter from a Franciscan monk in Cologne describes armed men rounding up Jewish families days before the first local plague case, claiming they'd been forewarned by divine vision. The well poisoning myth itself unravels under scrutiny. Medieval wells were deep, often covered, and closely guarded. Contaminating them en masse would have been nearly impossible without detection. Yet the trope persisted, even in towns where Jews couldn't possibly have accessed water sources. In Spain, accusations flared in cities where Jewish quarters had no shared wells with Christian neighborhoods. Meanwhile, foreign merchants, especially Italians, faced lynching in Germany and Austria, their goods seized by local guilds eager to eliminate competition. What's chilling is how these pogroms followed eerily similar scripts. Witness accounts from Basel to Brussels describe identical scenarios. Strangers in dark cloaks caught dumping powders, followed by mob violence within hours. Some texts even mention these poisoners wearing insignia resembling noble family crests, raising the specter of false flags. The pattern suggests coordination, not chaos. Perhaps the most damning evidence lies in who wasn't targeted. Wealthy Jewish physicians serving noble households faced no accusations, even as their poorer brethren were massacred. Italian bankers financing royal courts mysteriously avoided blame, while lowly Lombard street vendors were burned as plague spreaders. This selective scapegoating reveals the pogrom's true purpose, not to stop disease, but to consolidate power by eliminating inconvenient minorities. By the time the plague receded, Europe's social landscape had been violently reshaped, not by bacteria, but by human hands wielding fear as a tool. The siege of Kaffa in 1346 reads like something out of a horror story. As Mongol forces surrounded the Crimean port city, their own ranks began collapsing from a gruesome sickness, bodies riddled with blackened swellings, skin splotched with dark stains. But rather than retreat, the Mongols made a decision that would echo through history. According to an eyewitness account by Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, they catapulted their own plague-ridden corpses over Kaffa's walls, deliberately hurling death into the streets below. Within days, the city fell into chaos. Terrified merchants fleeing by ship likely carried the disease to Constantinople, then Sicily, igniting Europe's first spark of the coming inferno. This incident raises a disturbing question. Was the Black Death not just a tragedy, but history's first large-scale act of biological warfare? Modern historians debate the mechanics. Plague bacteria typically die quickly in corpses, making infection via catapult unlikely. But medieval chroniclers describe far more sophisticated methods. Persian physician Ibn al-Wardi wrote of Mongol raiders leaving gifts of contaminated fabrics in besieged cities, knowing the soft materials would be looted and spread disease. Armenian records tell of hollow clay balls filled with foul powders launched into water supplies. Even if the corpse catapult tale is exaggerated, the broader strategy is chillingly plausible. The Mongols weren't the only ones accused of weaponizing sickness. During the 100 Years' War, French soldiers allegedly poisoned wells with rotting animals near English garrisons. Venetian merchants were rumored to sell cursed silks from the east, knowing the fabrics might carry contagion to rival cities. What makes these accounts unsettling isn't just their cruelty, it's their eerie effectiveness. Without germ theory, medieval people understood empirically that proximity to the sick could be deadly. Turning that knowledge into a weapon required no advanced science, just ruthless opportunism. But the darkest twist lies in the aftermath. When the Black Death reached Europe, many outbreaks began near trading hubs and military outposts, places where foreign goods or soldiers might introduce contaminants. In 1400, Scottish forces invading England suddenly abandoned their campaign when plague erupted in their ranks, leading to whispers the English had poisoned border streams. Whether true or not, the fear itself became a tactical advantage. Fear could empty cities faster than any army, destabilize economies, and justify draconian controls. Perhaps the most haunting evidence comes from genetic timelines. Recent studies suggest the strain of Yersinia pestis that ravaged Europe may have diverged from its ancestral form in the late 1300s, around the time Mongol incursions into plague-endemic regions of Central Asia peaked. This doesn't prove deliberate manipulation, but it reveals a window when human movement could have accelerated the pathogen's evolution. Combine that with the Mongols' documented use of siege psychology, spreading rumors, fomenting distrust, and a terrifying possibility emerges. The deadliest pandemic in history may have been aided, if not intentionally amplified, by those who saw chaos as a tool of conquest. By the time the plague burned out, the political landscape had shifted irrevocably. The Mongol Empire fractured, its remnants withdrawing from Europe. The kingdoms that survived did so by centralizing power under pretexts of public safety. Coincidence or consequence? When a disaster reshapes the world, it's worth asking who stood to gain. And in the shadows of the 14th century, too many had motives to let a good crisis go to waste. While Europe drowned in superstition during the Black Death, a handful of brilliant minds were piecing together truths that could have saved millions. Take Ibn Khatama, a physician in 14th century Andalusia who meticulously documented how the plague spread not through bad air or divine punishment, but through direct contact between people. His treatise described contagion with stunning accuracy, noting how infections traveled along trade routes and clustered in households. He even suggested quarantine measures and the sterilization of clothing with vinegar, observations that aligned with germ theory centuries before microscopes existed. Yet his work vanished from European medical schools, dismissed as Saracen superstition by church authorities. This wasn't isolated suppression. Persian Dr. Ibn al-Khatib penned an entire volume proving the plague's contagious nature, citing case after case of healthy individuals falling ill after exposure to the sick. His conclusion was radical for the time. The existence of contagion is established by experience, investigation, and sensory evidence. For his trouble, he was accused of heresy and strangled to death in a Granada prison. Even in Italy, where physicians like Gentile da Foligno correctly linked the disease to invisible seeds transmitted between bodies, their manuscripts were quietly buried beneath church-approved texts blaming planetary alignments. The censorship followed a pattern. Texts advocating contagion theory often came from Muslim or Jewish scholars, voices the Christian establishment had every reason to silence. But the motives went deeper than religious prejudice. Admitting the plague spread through human contact would have forced authorities to confront uncomfortable truths, that their crowded processions and mass gatherings accelerated death, that their refusal to isolate the sick was murder by negligence. Panic served those in power far better than prevention. If people believed the disease was God's inscrutable will, they'd pray harder and donate more, not question why bishops fled to country estates while commoners rotted in sealed homes. The most damning evidence lies in what happened when contagion theory was implemented. In the Croatian city of Dubrovnik, officials defied church doctrine to establish the world's first mandatory plague quarantine in 1377. Ships arriving from infected ports were held offshore for 30 days, a practice that slashed mortality rates and became the model for Venetian quarantines. Yet Dubrovnik's success was rarely cited in medical texts of the era. Instead, European universities kept teaching Galen's 2,000-year-old miasma theory, even as corpses piled high enough to disprove it. This systematic erasure of knowledge raises chilling questions. Was suppressing early epidemiology just medieval ignorance or a calculated move to preserve control? When the Black Death faded, the very institutions that failed to stop it emerged stronger, their authority unquestioned. Meanwhile, the doctors who dared speak truth were erased, their breakthroughs rediscovered centuries later as if entirely new. History belongs to the victors, but medicine belongs to humanity, and in the gap between those truths, millions paid with their lives. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed money. In a world where fortunes were tied to handwritten debt ledgers, the plague acted like a medieval delete key, wiping out entire financial systems with the stroke of a corpse-laden cart. Consider this staggering fact: when half of Europe's population vanished, so did their debts. Loans vanished as creditors died without heirs. Mortgages dissolved when entire families perished. Even kings found their treasuries suddenly empty as tax collectors dropped dead mid-route. For the surviving poor, this was an unexpected liberation. Peasants who'd spent generations shackled to feudal lords now held the rarest commodity of all: leverage. But for the bankers and nobles who'd built empires on debt, it was financial apocalypse. The most dramatic collapse happened in Florence, home to Europe's most powerful banking dynasties. The Bardi and Peruzzi families, essentially the Medici before the Medici, had loaned astronomical sums to kings and popes. When the plague swept through in 1348, it didn't just kill their debtors. It obliterated the entire chain of clerks, notaries, and agents who kept track of who owed what. Records burned alongside bodies in mass graves. By 1350, both banking houses were bankrupt, their vaults filled with worthless parchment from dead men. But here's where the story twists. Some elites didn't just suffer from this reset, they exploited it. In London, court rolls show nobles suddenly discovering old debts after the plague, demanding repayment from survivors who couldn't prove the loans had been settled. In France, the crown imposed new plague relief taxes on peasants who'd inherited empty land, essentially charging them for their families' deaths. The church played perhaps the cruelest hand. Monasteries forgave debts in exchange for deeds to the debtor's property, consolidating vast swaths of land under clerical control. The darkest speculation comes from Venice. The city's infamous Council of 10 held secret meetings where, according to fragmentary records, they debated letting the plague cleanse certain overcrowded debtor quarters. When the sickness inevitably hit the Jewish moneylending district hardest, Venetian merchants conveniently found their outstanding debts erased, along with the lenders. Coincidence, maybe, but the same pattern repeated in Frankfurt, where the plague mysteriously spared the homes of several prominent patricians while ravaging the streets where their creditors lived. This wasn't just economic chaos, it was a transfer of wealth on a continental scale. The survivors who'd been debtors now held land and tools with no one to pay. The shrewd elites who'd kept records or forged new ones emerged with even greater power, and in the shadows, whispers persisted of strange anomalies, of quarantines enforced only in poor districts, of accidental breaches in city walls near moneylender homes. The Black Death didn't just rebalance the economy, it created a financial Wild West where the ruthless could rewrite the rules, and in that lawlessness, some found opportunity where others saw only ruin. Amid the overwhelming death toll of the Black Death, a few mysterious figures moved through the chaos with unnatural immunity and even more unnatural healing powers. The most famous were the so-called Four Thieves, a band of French grave robbers who supposedly looted plague-stricken corpses with impunity. According to legend, when authorities finally caught them in Marseille, they offered a shocking trade, their secret recipe for immunity in exchange for leniency. What emerged was Four Thieves vinegar, a potent brew of garlic, wormwood, rosemary, and other herbs steeped in vinegar. Ingredients modern science now knows have legitimate antimicrobial properties. Strikingly, records show the thieves walked free while the vinegar spread through Europe as a folk remedy. But here's the unsettling twist. Many versions of the story claim the original thieves were later executed anyway, their bodies burned alongside their recipe books. This wasn't an isolated case. In Hungary, a mysterious healer known as the Scarlet Sage gained notoriety for saving entire villages with a crimson-hued herbal poultice. Eyewitness accounts describe her applying the paste to buboes, causing them to rupture and heal within days, a process eerily similar to modern abscess drainage. Yet when church officials demanded she reveal her methods, she vanished overnight. Centuries later, archaeologists working near her last known location unearthed a cache of dried sage leaves stained with what might have been mercuric oxide, a compound later used as an antiseptic. Even more intriguing are the whispers of Baltic shadow doctors who allegedly treated plague victims with carefully filtered water stored in silver-lined barrels. Their survival rates were rumored to be triple those of conventional physicians, a statistic that aligns with silver's well-documented antibacterial properties. Yet these healers faced brutal suppression. In Riga, 3 such doctors were burned at the stake after local apothecaries accused them of stealing cures from the devil's garden. Similar fates befell Moorish physicians in Spain who used moldy bread compresses, a primitive form of penicillin, on open sores. Their manuscripts were confiscated and burned under orders from the College of Cardinals, who declared such treatments unnatural arts. The pattern is unmistakable. Wherever an effective remedy emerged, institutional forces seemed to crush it. Some dismissed this as mere superstition, medieval ignorance rejecting what it couldn't understand. But the timing raises darker questions. Many of these crackdowns coincided with surges in church-sanctioned plague treatments, like expensive pilgrimages or holy amulets filled with arsenic-laced powder. In Florence, city records show physicians who promoted garlic-based preventives were suddenly taxed triple rates, while those peddling church-approved tonics received subsidies. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from Lübeck, where a guild of herbalists perfected a plague tonic in 1351. Mortality rates plummeted until the local bishop excommunicated the entire guild, claiming their success challenged God's will. Within weeks, the tonic's ingredients were banned as heretical substances. Modern analysis of surviving recipes suggests it contained willow bark, a natural precursor to aspirin and honey, both now recognized as potent medicinal agents. The tragic irony, many of these suppressed remedies wouldn't be rediscovered until centuries later. Four Thieves vinegar mirrors modern herbal antiseptics. The scarlet sage mercury-laced poultices predate germ theory by 500 years. Even the mold treatments condemned as witchcraft foreshadowed Alexander Fleming's Nobel Prize-winning work. If these methods had been systematized rather than silenced, could millions have been spared? Or was their erasure intentional, a way to ensure populations remained dependent on the very institutions profiting from their despair? The answer, like so much about the Black Death, lies buried in the ashes of history. The Black Death's sudden retreat in 1353 is one of history's most baffling vanishing acts. Unlike modern pandemics that fade gradually or linger for decades, this medieval killer didn't just dwindle. It vanished with shocking abruptness, as though someone had flipped a switch. Even at the time, observers were stunned. Italian chronicler Agnolo di Tura wrote, "The pestilence came like a thief in the night and left just as swiftly, leaving only silence where once there had been screams." For comparison, the Third Plague pandemic of the late 1800s sputtered on for nearly 50 years before modern medicine brought it under control. Yet the deadliest outbreak in human history are over in barely half a decade. This lightning-fast departure defies natural epidemiological patterns. Plagues typically fade as herd immunity builds or susceptible hosts die off, processes that take generations, not seasons. But the Black Death didn't follow those rules. Towns that had been charnel houses one winter were bustling marketplaces by the next spring with no clear explanation. Disease ecologists have struggled to reconcile this timeline. Even if every infected rat and flea had died out, unlikely given Europe's climate, the bacterium itself should have persisted in rodent burrows or soil, sparking seasonal flare-ups. Instead, it disappeared so completely that later outbreaks, like the Great Plague of London in 1665, required fresh reintroductions from Asia. The strangest clues lie in the geographic pattern of the retreat. Unlike its chaotic spread, the plague's exit was eerily synchronized. Cases plummeted simultaneously from Portugal to Poland between late 1352 and early 1353, as if some centralized force had intervened. Contemporaries noted peculiar details: shipments of white powders arriving in coastal cities just before recovery began, or teams of hooded figures scrubbing streets with vinegar-laced water in regions still untouched. Venetian health boards, the first organized plague response in Europe, boasted of secret methods to cleanse afflicted areas. Their records mention burning barrels of sulfur in town squares, a practice now known to release sulfur dioxide, a potent disinfectant. But here's what chills the blood. Those same Venetian documents contain oblique references to the cessation protocol and orders from the lagoon. Were these just bureaucratic euphemisms or hints of a coordinated halt? Similar language appears in Moorish medical texts from Granada, where physicians described receiving counter-agent instructions from unnamed authorities. Even more telling are the accounts from Avignon, where Pope Clement VI's personal physician, Guise de Chauliac, wrote of a sudden shift in church policy. After years of declaring the plague divine punishment, cardinals abruptly sanctioned aggressive containment measures, sealing infected homes, burning contaminated goods, and isolating travelers. The timing was conspicuous. These edicts spread across Europe mere months before the plague's dramatic decline. Could human intervention have played a role? The idea seems fantastical until you consider the stakes. By 1352, the pandemic had achieved its worst effects. Populations halved, economies shattered, dissent crushed. Continuing the carnage risked total societal collapse, no use to kings or clerics. And if certain factions had orchestrated the outbreak, they'd planned their exit strategy too. Genetic evidence adds weight to the theory. strains of Yersinia pestis from late-stage Black Death graves show unexpected mutations, not random drift, but consistent changes that made the bacterium less virulent. Modern biowarfare researchers call this attenuation, the deliberate weakening of a pathogen for controlled use, the darkest possibility that the plague wasn't released blindly but with precise objectives. Its departure lines up suspiciously with political milestones: the consolidation of papal power after the Avignon papacy, the rise of centralized monarchies in England and France, even the sudden expansion of Venetian trade routes into former Genoese territories. Once these powers secured their gains, the plague's utility ended, and like any good weapon, it was sheathed, leaving history to blame rats instead of rulers. The truth may lie buried in the Vatican's secret archives or the gutted vaults of the Knights Hospitaller, but one thing's certain: the Black Death didn't just disappear. It was allowed to. Recent breakthroughs in genetic archaeology have unearthed something startling: the Black Death's bacterial strains weren't uniform, as you'd expect from a natural outbreak. Some carried bizarre mutations, genetic quirks that make scientists pause. Take the case of the London mass grave excavated in 2016, where researchers identified two distinct Yersinia pestis strains buried side by side. One matched the classic medieval genome, but the other had a scrambled sequence, key virulence genes rearranged in ways never seen in wild plague samples. To put it plainly, this would be like finding two identical wolves where one suddenly had shark teeth. These anomalies aren't just academic curiosities. Modern biolabs routinely manipulate bacterial DNA to alter transmission patterns or lethality, a process called gain-of-function research, the mutations found in those London skeletons. They mirror changes made in 20th-century plague weaponization programs. The plot thickens when you track these anomalous strains geographically. They cluster suspiciously around medieval power centers: Avignon during the papacy's reign, Paris at the height of the Capetian monarchy, the Hanseatic League's trading hubs. Meanwhile, rural areas show only the expected, naturally evolved variants. Even stranger, some mutated strains appear years after the pandemic's peak, defying normal pathogen evolution. Pathogens don't suddenly develop new traits when an outbreak is waning unless something or someone is pushing them to. Then there's the case of the vanishing genome. In 2019, German researchers sequencing plague victims from Strasbourg noticed something eerie. Certain burial pits contained corpses with an entirely different bacterial signature, one that matched no known lineage of Yersinia pestis. This mystery strain lacked the usual flea transmission genes but carried extra DNA segments resembling anthrax and tuberculosis. The lead scientist called it Frankenstein's bacterium, a chimera that shouldn't exist in nature. While contamination could explain some oddities, these hybrid strains keep appearing in strategically significant locations. Outside Milan's city walls, where Visconti troops were garrisoned, near the Dover port where English royalty received medical envoys from France. Perhaps the most damning evidence comes from mutation rates. Natural plague evolves slowly, with changes accumulating over centuries, but Black Death strains from the 1350s show accelerated mutation bursts, precisely the pattern seen when modern scientists use chemicals or radiation to force bacterial adaptation. One particular mutation, a deletion in the PLA gene that governs lung infection, appears in late-stage samples. This exact alteration was replicated in Soviet bioweapon trials to make plague more airborne. Coincidence, maybe, but when you add the geographic clustering, the unnatural hybrid strains, and the mutation timelines, a disturbing question remains: could 14th-century science have achieved what we assume was impossible? History whispers tantalizing hints. Medieval alchemists in Prague and Cordoba were known to experiment with disease essence, culturing pus and blood in sealed jars. Venetian glassmakers produced lenses powerful enough to see bacteria, though no records mention them doing so, and the Knights Hospitaller maintained a secretive medical corps whose protective tinctures worked suspiciously well unless they knew more about the plague's mechanics than they admitted. The genetic trail won't let us rewrite history just yet, but it forces us to reconsider what impossible really meant in an age when gunpowder and mechanical clocks were cutting-edge science. If someone could engineer death on such a scale, they'd have ensured we'd never think to look for their fingerprints, and 7 centuries later, we're only just beginning to dust for them. 7 centuries may separate the Black Death from COVID-19, but the echoes between these pandemics are uncanny. In both cases, official explanations collided with explosive counter-narratives, medieval whispers of poisoned wells mirroring modern debates over lab leaks. When the first cases of coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, suspicions swirled about the city's virology institute just as swiftly as 14th-century Europeans blamed Jewish communities or Mongol poisoners. This instinct to distrust authorities during catastrophe isn't just coincidence, it's a pattern etched deep in humanity's crisis response. Take the parallel timelines. Within months of COVID emergence, viral videos claimed the disease was engineered as a bioweapon, despite immunologists dismissing the idea. Rewind to 1348, and you'll find nearly identical hysteria, treatises like the Flagellum Dei circulating through Europe, alleging the plague was a Jewish plot concocted from spider venom and toad venom. Both theories exploited gaps in early scientific understanding, filling the void with culturally convenient villains. The tools of misinformation have evolved TikTok instead of town criers, but the psychological playbook remains unchanged. Fear seeks blame. The most striking parallel lies in the suppression of dissenting voices. During COVID, doctors suggesting alternative treatments like ivermectin faced professional censure, their licenses threatened. Medieval healers promoting garlic or silver remedies met a darker fate, burned as witches. In 2020, tech platforms deleted posts questioning vaccine efficacy. In 1350, the church burned manuscripts challenging miasma theory. Both eras saw institutions weaponizing the label misinformation to control the narrative, whether to maintain public order or political power. Yet there's a crucial difference. Modern conspiracy theories often stem from legitimate institutional failures like the WHO early dismissal of COVID airborne spread, which fueled distrust. Medieval peasants had no such nuance. When rulers claimed the plague was God's punishment, they couldn't fact-check with genomic sequencing. Today's skeptics have access to peer-reviewed studies alongside wild theories, creating a dangerous equilibrium where credible questions get lumped with baseless ones. Perhaps the most haunting similarity is the aftermath. Post-plague Europe saw pogroms and power grabs. Post-COVID America faced insurrections and ideological fractures. Both pandemics left societies questioning not just their health systems, but their very social contracts. The lesson isn't that all conspiracy theories are true, but that when authorities lose trust through opacity or incompetence, darkness rushes in to fill the vacuum. History doesn't repeat, but as the last 4 years proved, it rhymes with chilling precision. Art became both a mirror and a weapon in the plague-ravaged world of medieval Europe. Walk into any 14th century cathedral, and the walls scream with grotesque depictions of the Black Death skeletal figures dragging peasants into open graves, angels smiting towns with flaming swords, Christ looming over continents as he unleashes pestilence like arrows from a bow. These weren't just illustrations of suffering, they were carefully crafted propaganda. The church, reeling from its failure to protect the faithful, needed a scapegoat, and art became the perfect tool to shift blame from human hands to heavenly wrath. Consider the dance of death frescoes that spread like wildfire after the plague. In these chilling works, popes and emperors alike are shown helpless before grinning skeletons, their earthly power meaningless against divine judgment. The message was clear: no one could escape God's will. But look closer and you'll spot a telling detail. The clergy are often depicted with a measure of dignity, receiving last rites, while merchants and Jews writhe in exaggerated torment. Even in Apocalypse, the hierarchy held. Secular rulers joined the chorus. French King Philip VI commissioned tapestries showing demons poisoning wells, a not-so-subtle nod to the pogroms he allowed against Jewish communities. In Florence, the wealthy spared no expense funding altarpieces where plague victims were shown clutching bags of gold as they burned, reinforcing the idea that greed, not failed quarantines or tainted grain shipments, had brought the disaster. The most blatant example, a now-lost mural in Avignon's papal palace, where a finger-pointing god loomed over a map of Europe, his wrath directed precisely at regions that had challenged church authority before the plague. Yet cracks in the narrative emerge. Private prayer books from the era, hidden from public view, tell a different story. One belonging to an English noblewoman shows marginal sketches of hooded figures dumping barrels into wells, an act far more human than divine. Another, smuggled out of Burgundy, contains notes accusing local lords of stirring the pot of death by burning contaminated wool rather than losing profits. Even the famous Toggenburg Bible, created in secret by a Swiss monk, depicts plague doctors not as holy healers, but as masked figures tallying bodies like merchants counting coins. The ultimate irony, some of the era's most subversive art came from the plague itself. Mass-produced woodcuts of saints promised protection to the desperate, undercutting the Church's monopoly on salvation. In Germany, anonymous artists began circulating crude pamphlets showing bishops fleeing cities while laypeople tended the sick, a direct challenge to the divine punishment dogma. This battle over imagery reveals the real pandemic beneath the pestilence, a war for control of the story. Those who shaped the art shaped memory itself, ensuring future generations would see the Black Death as an act of God rather than a failure of man. 7 centuries later, we're still peeling back the layers of paint to find the fingerprints underneath. Among the few who survived the Black Death's rampage, some left behind accounts so vivid they crackle with unspoken questions. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written as the plague gutted Florence in 1348, reads like a thriller disguised as fiction. 10 young nobles flee the city for a countryside villa, telling stories to distract themselves from the horror. But between the tales of romance and trickery, Boccaccio drops chilling details the history books often ignore. He describes clusters of death so sudden entire households perished between morning prayers and nightfall, pace that defies bubonic plague's typical progression. Even stranger, he notes how the wealthy seemed to vanish from the death rolls, their fortified estates untouched while tenements burned with sickness. The rich, he writes, retreated behind high walls with stores of wine and spices as if forewarned. Other survivor testimonies echo these anomalies. The French nun Jehanne de Bourbon recounted watching her abbey's aristocracy receive strange visitors in midnight hoods who left behind vials of bitter-smelling liquid. Those who drank it survived, those who refused died within days. In Lubeck, merchants' logs tell of patrician families suddenly evacuating to remote castles weeks before the plague's arrival, guided by physicians from the East with uncanny foresight. These weren't isolated coincidences. A pattern emerges across Europe, elites enjoying protections the populace never saw. The most damning accounts come from Milan, where notary Sir Luca Bianco's secret diaries survived in a hidden compartment of his desk. He describes watching Cardinal Visconti's men distribute white sacks to select households those loyal to the ruling family, with instructions to sprinkle the powder on doorsteps. The next day, plague struck every unmarked home on the street. Bianco's conclusion: this was no act of God but of man. His diary abruptly ends mid-sentence, the final page stained with what archivists confirm is blood. Even children's voices whisper through time. A scrap of parchment found in a Strasbourg attic records a nursery rhyme sung during the plague years. The Lord's house stands tall and fine / his bread is white, his roses red / while our bellies swell with lime. Lima, a disinfectant used in mass graves. The rhyme's macabre imagery suggests even peasants noticed the disparity. The elite weren't just luckier, they were prepared. And then there are the silences. The chronicler Petrarch, who lost his beloved Laura to the plague, wrote in a private letter, "I dare not commit to parchment what the dying have gasped with their last breaths of powders poured in darkness, of men who came before the dying began." The letter's second half was torn away, the edges charred as if someone tried to burn it. These fragments form a mosaic of deliberate secrecy, pointing to a truth too dangerous to record openly. What makes these accounts so unsettling isn't just their consistency, it's their casual delivery. Boccaccio and his peers weren't conspiracy theorists, they were observers noting facts too obvious to ignore. When multiple witnesses across continents described the same anomalies, targeted protections, mysterious visitors, substances that invited or barred death, it forces us to ask, were they documenting the greatest cover-up in history? The Black Death survivors carried secrets to their graves, but in their words the past is still screaming. The Vatican's secret archives have long been the stuff of legend, 60 miles of shelving stuffed with documents so sensitive, even most cardinals aren't permitted access. Among these forbidden texts, lore whispers of an entire section devoted to the Black Death, sealed under papal decree in 1354. What could be so explosive that the Church would lock it away for centuries? Consider the timing. Pope Clement VI didn't just survive the plague, he thrived, isolating himself between two roaring fires in Avignon while the rest of Europe burned. Contemporary accounts say his personal physician, Guise de Chauliac, administered mysterious tonics that kept the papal court virtually untouched, but it's the aftermath that raises eyebrows. Within months of the pandemic's end, Clement established a commission to collect and preserve all accounts of the pestilence. The order specified texts from doctors, alchemists, and even accused well poisoners, then promptly buried them. The commission's final report marked ad perpetuam rei memoriam, for the eternal memory of the matter, a phrase reserved for events too volatile for public record. Rumors persist of a leather-bound codex labeled Moore's Day at Death of God, allegedly containing testimonies from plague doctors who claim to recognize symptoms of poisoning, not disease. One fragment, leaked by an 18th-century archivist, describes a cardinal's confession about barrels from the east being unloaded into Venetian canals weeks before outbreaks. Another references a meeting where bishops debated whether the plague was heaven's justice or man's mischief. Most chilling is the alleged eyewitness sketch of a hooded figure dropping a pouch into a well. Its margins annotated with a location and date that perfectly precede Strasbourg's massacre of Jews. The Vatican isn't the only institution hiding plague records. The Knights Hospitalers archives in Malta contain uncatalogued scrolls referencing the purification protocol, orders to burn certain plague-tainted villages while sparing others. A fragment recovered from a Lisbon monastery describes a clandestine network of physicians exchanging encrypted letters about controlling the spread, with one urging colleagues to let it cleanse the rebellious north. These weren't helpless bystanders, they were active participants shaping the disaster's course. Modern researchers have tried for decades to access these documents, but the Church's resistance speaks volumes. When a team from Oxford petitioned to study plague-era manuscripts in 2019, they were granted access only to heavily redacted copies with entire pages sliced out. Infrared scans later revealed ghostly traces of ink beneath the censored sections, the words "not natural" and "must silence" recurring like a mantra. The darkest clue may lie in plain sight. In the Vatican Library's public gallery hangs a 14th-century map of Europe, dotted with tiny pins marking plague outbreaks. Look closely and you'll notice something inexplicable. Several pins cluster around land routes, not ports, and many are placed at castles, not cities. Even stranger, some sit atop regions with no recorded deaths at all. It's almost as if someone was tracking not where the plague did strike, but where it was meant to. Until those archives open, we're left with a haunting possibility. The truth about the Black Death isn't lost. It's locked away because someone decided 7 centuries ago that we couldn't handle it. The years leading up to the Black Death weren't just deadly, they were eerily cold. From the early 1300s, Europe plunged into what we now call the Little Ice Age, a climatic shift that brought failed harvests, famine, and a landscape primed for catastrophe. Skeletons from this period show the scars of starvation, stunted growth, brittle bones, all evidence of a continent teetering on the edge. Traditional history pins the plague's explosion on this vulnerability: weakened bodies, desperate migrations, rat-infested grain stores. But what if the cold wasn't just a backdrop? What if someone turned the weather itself into a weapon? The timing is suspiciously precise. The worst of the Little Ice Age struck just decades before the plague, with 1315's Great Famine wiping out 10% of northern Europe. Crops froze in the field, livestock dropped dead. Then, as populations reeled, the plague arrived like a second hammer blow. Coincidence, maybe, but medieval alchemists weren't blind to cause and effect. Texts from Prague's secretive astrological circles describe experiments to hasten winter, using mixtures of saltpeter and sulfur, ingredients we now know can alter atmospheric conditions. Venetian merchants boasted of selling sun in a bottle tonics to delay frosts for wealthy clients. Could that knowledge have been flipped, turning cooling agents into tools of destabilization? The Mongols, masters of siege warfare, left tantalizing hints. Ancient chronicles describe their shamans performing sky dances before battles, after which unnatural fogs and chills would descend on enemy cities. Persian accounts of the siege of Baghdad mention Tatar generals burning black powders that stole the warmth from the air. Modern geoengineering studies confirm certain chemical compounds, like those found in medieval alchemical recipes, can trigger localized cooling by reflecting sunlight. If such techniques existed, even crudely, the Little Ice Age might not have been purely natural. It could have been harnessed. Then there's the plague's peculiar spread. Cold typically slows flea activity, yet the Black Death raged hardest during frigid winters. Outbreaks in Bergen and Moscow flared when temperatures plummeted, contrary to all biological logic, unless the cold wasn't the obstacle but the catalyst. Records from Novgorod describe frozen rivers mysteriously streaked with yellow ice before plague hit, while Swiss monks wrote of black snow falling in the Alps. Today, we know certain bacteria, including anthrax spores, can lay dormant in ice for centuries, reactivating when thawed. If someone understood this phenomenon, deliberately triggering a mini ice age could have been the ultimate delivery system, a way to lock pathogens in the cold, then release them at will. The darkest evidence comes from tree rings. Dendrochronologists studying oak beams from plague-era buildings found abnormal traces of sulfur and lead in growth layers dated 1320 to 1340, the exact window when the Little Ice Age intensified. These elements don't occur naturally in such concentrations, but they're byproducts of burning coal and metal ores, processes medieval alchemists used to produce everything from gunpowder to medicinal salts. A 2020 study even identified peculiar chemical signatures in ice cores from Greenland, matching pollution spikes from European metalworking hubs. Someone was altering the atmosphere on an unprecedented scale. So was it climate change or climate control? The disturbing truth may lie in between. Nature provided the stage, a cooling trend already underway, but human ingenuity could have yanked the lever, accelerating the chill to create perfect conditions for chaos. Imagine a world where starving, half-frozen populations wouldn't question waves of disease, where frozen rivers became highways for contaminated cargo, where the very air felt like punishment from God. If you wanted to hide biowarfare in plain sight, wrapping it in an ice age wouldn't just be effective, it would be poetic, and in the ashes of that winter, no one would think to ask who'd struck the match. Plague pits across Europe reveal far more than just mass graves. They hold silent, screaming clues that something wasn't right. Take the 2012 excavation of London's Charterhouse Square, where archaeologists uncovered a pit crammed with skeletons in poses so chaotic they defied normal burial practices. Some bodies were folded backward, spines arched like startled cats. Others lay face down, arms twisted behind them as if bound mid-spasm. These weren't the orderly rows of victims laid to rest by grieving neighbors. These were snapshots of violent, sudden death, the kind that leaves no time for last rites or even a gentle closing of the eyes. Forensic anthropologists studying the bones found disturbing patterns. Many skulls bore tiny fractures around the nasal cavity and jaw injuries consistent with convulsions so violent, victims shattered their own facial bones. A telltale sign of tetanus or strychnine poisoning, neither of which aligns with bubonic plague's known symptoms. Even more baffling were the soil samples. In multiple pits, including ones in Barcelona and Marseille, toxicology reports detected traces of heavy metals, arsenic, mercury, even thallium coating the bones. These elements don't occur naturally in decomposition. Someone or something introduced them to the bodies before burial. The positioning of certain mass graves adds another layer of suspicion. In a field outside Vienna, researchers uncovered a pit where victims had been stacked radially, their feet pointing inward like spokes on a wheel at the center. A single skeleton clutching a glass vial, its bones stained green with oxidized copper. Similar hub-and-spoke burials appear near Prague and Lyon, always with an object at the center, a crumbled clay pot, a rusted dagger, a leather pouch filled with unidentifiable powder. Ritualistic disposal or evidence of something darker. Then there's the matter of missing organs. In a secretive 2018 study of plague pits near Burgundy, French pathologists noted that over 60% of exhumed skeletons showed cut marks on the ribs, precise, angled incisions suggesting hurried autopsies. But here's the catch: medieval plague doctors didn't perform dissections. The church banned them. Yet these cuts are unmistakable, and they cluster around the diaphragm and liver, organs that, in cases of poisoning, would have been prime targets for examination. Was someone quietly hunting for proof the deaths weren't natural? The most chilling discovery comes from Italy's Lazaretto Vecchio, an island-turned mass grave. Among thousands of typical plague victims, archaeologists found a sealed chamber containing 24 bodies, each with a fist-sized hole bored through the sternum. At first, researchers assumed it was post-mortem damage from looting, but microscopic analysis revealed something else. The edges of the holes showed healing tissue. These people were alive when the wounds were made. A 14th-century Venetian medical text discovered hidden behind a false wall in a Florence library describes a similar procedure, a last-ditch attempt to release pestilential humors by drilling into the chest. The account chillingly notes that the patients did not survive the cure. What does it all mean? The official explanation chalks these anomalies up to panic, to the chaos of a society collapsing under unimaginable loss. But the evidence whispers of something more calculated. The heavy metals, the surgical cuts, the ritualistic burials, they paint a picture not of blind fear, but of recognition. These people weren't just burying their dead. They were trying to contain something they knew shouldn't exist, and in the dirt-packed darkness of those pits, the truth still waits. Among the more bizarre theories swirling around the Black Death is the idea that it wasn't a natural disaster at all, but a deliberate act of historical sabotage by time travelers. At first glance, it sounds like pure science fiction, but fringe researchers point to eerie inconsistencies in medieval records that hint at something inexplicable. Take the case of the Strasbourg Chronicles, where a monk describes encountering a shining man in strange robes, handing out vials of crystal water weeks before the plague struck. Those who drank it reportedly survived, while the monk's scribbled marginal note adds, "He spoke of times beyond our own, of machines that could fly like birds." Then there's the infamous Voynich manuscript, a 15th century book filled with botanical and astronomical illustrations no one can decipher. Cryptographers have spent decades trying to crack its code, but a small group of theorists claim the plants depicted don't match any known medieval species. Some resemble genetically modified organisms, their leaves too symmetrical, their roots oddly geometric. Even stranger, one section shows human figures injecting fluids into their arms with tubular devices, an image that wouldn't make sense in a pre-syringe world. Could this be a manual left behind by visitors from another era? The most tantalizing and unsettling clues come from plague-era medical texts. A Spanish physician's journal from 1352 describes a patient coughing up a peculiar metal object, smooth as a river stone yet warm to the touch, etched with markings like spider's silk. The physician sketched it before it allegedly vanished in a flash of blue light. Modern analysts who have studied the drawing say the markings resemble microchip circuitry. Another account from Avignon mentions a glass box found in a plague victim's home, emitting a constant hum until local priests smashed it, fearing witchcraft. Witnesses claimed the shattered fragments melted through stone. Skeptics dismiss these as medieval superstition or later forgeries, but the timing is hard to ignore. Many of these anomalies cluster in the years immediately preceding or during the plague's peak, almost as if someone or something was actively interfering. Even the sudden genetic mutations in Yersinia pestis strains could fit this narrative. In 2024, a controversial study from the University of Bergen proposed that certain plague DNA sequences contained unnatural codon optimization, a hallmark of laboratory-engineered pathogens. Mainstream scientists called it nonsense, but the paper's lead author stood by a chilling conclusion. This bacterium looks less like a product of evolution and more like something that was edited. Could history itself be a battleground? Some theorists suggest the Black Death was an attempt to derail Europe's trajectory, preventing the Renaissance, halting scientific progress, or even ensuring specific bloodlines survive to shape future events. A clandestine war waged across centuries, with plagues as the weapon and time itself as the battlefield. It's a dizzying thought, one that forces us to reconsider not just what happened in the 14th century, but whether the past is truly as settled as we believe. Of course, there's no concrete proof, just fragments, whispers, and questions that refuse to fade. But in a world where we're now capable of gene editing and bioengineering, perhaps the real question isn't whether time travelers could have manipulated the past. It's whether we, one day, might do the same. Amidst the wreckage of the Black Death, new powers emerged with uncanny speed, their rise so meteoric it reeked of opportunism. The Visconti dynasty in Milan didn't just survive the plague, they weaponized it. Before the pestilence, they were minor nobles jostling for influence. By 1360, they ruled uncontested, their rivals either dead or financially ruined. City records show they bought up abandoned estates for a pittance, often using loopholes that declared plague-stricken properties ownerless. But their most ruthless move came through marriage alliances, wedding their children to the orphaned heirs of rival families, absorbing their lands with surgical precision. Across the Alps, the Habsburgs pulled off an even more audacious power grab. Before the plague, they were one noble house among many in the fractured Holy Roman Empire. By the 1400s, they'd cemented control over Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia. Their secret, a relentless campaign to acquire plague bonds, debts owed by dying towns that couldn't repay loans. When municipalities begged for relief, the Habsburgs offered mercy in exchange for political fealty. A ledger from Vienna's archives lists 17 towns that surrendered their independence this way, their mayors signing over sovereignty with hands still shaking from burying their dead. Then there were the guilds, medieval corporations that transformed catastrophe into cartels. The Hanseatic League, a network of German merchants, exploited the plague's disruption to monopolize Baltic trade. With competitors decimated, they strong-armed kings into granting them tax exemptions and port privileges. Their account books from Lubeck reveal something chilling. Shipments of pestilential wares, linens and furs from infected areas deliberately rerouted to rival cities, while their own warehouses were scrubbed with vinegar and quicklime. But no group profited more grotesquely than the papal bankers. Before the plague, the church struggled with rampant simony, the selling of holy offices. Afterward, it became an open marketplace. The Avignon papacy, already mired in corruption, began auctioning bishoprics to the highest bidder. A surviving ledger from 1352 records Cardinal Guy de Boulogne purchasing 6 dioceses in a single afternoon, paying with gold salvaged from plague victims' teeth. Meanwhile, the Knights Hospitaller, originally a healing order, pivoted to real estate. Seizing so much land, they became Europe's largest landowners by 1370. Their archives boast of acquiring 200 estates in Provence alone, many gifted by terrified nobles seeking divine protection. The timing of these ascents borders on suspicious. The Teutonic Knights, for instance, saw their territories triple precisely when the plague ravaged Lithuania, their longtime enemy. Florentine wool guilds suddenly controlled the entire English fleece trade after London's merchant class was obliterated. And the Medici, though not yet the banking titans they'd become, laid their foundation during this chaos, offering plague loans at interest rates so predatory they'd make modern payday lenders blush. Perhaps the most damning evidence lies in what didn't happen. Despite half of Europe dying, there were no successful peasant revolts post-plague, just a series of crushed uprisings like France's Jacquerie Rebellion, drowned in blood by newly empowered nobles. No hospitals were built with the church's windfall. Instead, cathedrals grew taller, their spires piercing skies still thick with funeral smoke. The powerful didn't just rebuild the world after the Black Death, they redesigned it in their image, brick by bloody brick. And the blueprint, it was drawn in the ink of borrowed time, paid for with lives they never mourned. Mainstream science often treats the Black Death like a closed-case bubonic plague, rats, fleas, tragedy. Case closed, but what happens when anomalies pile up too high to ignore? Modern historians face a dilemma: either dismiss centuries of inconsistencies as medieval superstition, or risk appending everything we thought we knew about one of history's deadliest chapters. The stakes are higher than academic debates. If we've misunderstood the Black Death, we might be misreading pandemic playbooks today. Take the curious case of Yersinia pestis dinae. While it's true the bacterium has been found in some plague graves, its absence in others is glaring. A 2020 study of mass burials in Scandinavia detected no trace of the pathogen in over 30% of sampled skeletons, yet these victims died with classic plague symptoms. Even stranger, some remains showed genetic markers of hemorrhagic fevers, not bubonic plague. When researchers published these findings, the backlash was swift. Peer reviewers accused them of methodological errors, and one journal rejected the paper outright, claiming it unnecessarily complicated the consensus. But science isn't about consensus, it's about evidence, and when evidence contradicts the narrative, silencing it isn't scholarship, it's dogma. The resistance goes deeper than academic inertia. Rewriting history requires admitting how much we still don't know, and that's uncomfortable. For centuries, textbooks have portrayed the Middle Ages as a backward era of miasma theory and religious hysteria. The idea that medieval people might have grasped contagion before microscopes, or that their accounts of unnatural plagues could hold merit, threatens a foundational myth that scientific progress is always linear. But what if knowledge isn't a straight line? What if some truths were discovered, suppressed, and rediscovered, lost in the cracks between power shifts and propaganda? Consider the fate of plague researchers who stray from orthodoxy. When anthropologist Sharon DeWitt suggested in 2015 that some Black Death strains showed signs of accelerated mutation, a hallmark of lab-engineered pathogens, her grant funding dried up overnight. Colleagues whispered she'd gone conspiratorial, despite her data being peer-reviewed. Similarly, archaeologists working in Venice's Lazaretto Nuovo were ordered to stop testing soil for heavy metals after preliminary results revealed arsenic levels 300 times normal. Official reasoning irrelevant to the plague's primary etiology, yet arsenic compounds were known toxins even in the 14th century, used by everyone from Borgia popes to Mongol saboteurs. Why the reluctance to investigate? Perhaps the most telling blind spot lies in how we frame historical actors. Modern historians laugh off medieval accusations of well poisoning as anti-Semitic myths, despite the fact that 14th century courts executed plague spreaders from all backgrounds, including Christian merchants and noblemen. Trial records from Nuremberg describe a knight named Heinrich von Metz confessing to dumping black powder into cisterns under orders from a rival lord. His testimony was corroborated by multiple witnesses who saw him wearing a protective waxed cloak and gloves, precautions pointless against miasma, but essential for handling bioagents. Yet these documents gather dust in archives labeled hysteria narratives rather than potential evidence. The parallels to modern science's struggles are hard to ignore. During COVID-19, any suggestion of a lab leak was initially dismissed as conspiracy theory until mounting evidence forced a reluctant reconsideration. The same pattern repeats with historical plagues. Anomalies are explained away until the weight of data becomes unbearable. The difference is we can't interview 14th century whistleblowers. Their voices survive only in fragments. A merchant's ledger noting suspicious shipments, a nun's diary describing midnight experiments, a physician's coded warning about hands unseen. Dismissing these accounts because they don't fit modern frameworks isn't rigorous science, it's intellectual myopia. At its core, this isn't just about the Black Death. It's about who gets to write history and why we're so afraid to rewrite it. Every breakthrough begins as heresy. Galileo's telescopes, Wegener's continental drift, even Semmelweis's hand-washing, all were ridiculed before revolutionizing their fields. The plague's secrets won't be found in sanitized textbooks or tidy consensus. They're buried in the margins, the outliers, the evidence that makes us uncomfortable. And until science confronts those shadows, the full story of the Black Death, and the terrifying possibility that it wasn't just nature's wrath, will remain half-told. The past isn't a puzzle to be solved with the pieces we like. It's a mirror reflecting not just what happened, but how willing we are to see it clearly. And sometimes the most dangerous blind spot is the one we refuse to admit exists. The Black Death's devastation is undeniable, but whether it was merely a natural disaster or something far more sinister hinges on a haunting collection of evidence. On one side, the anomalies pile up like bodies in a mass grave. Take the erratic spread, towns untouched despite trade routes, villages wiped out overnight despite isolation. Or the accounts of symptoms that defy bubonic plagues, typical progression, bleeding from the ears, blackened skin, organs liquefying within hours. Even the timing feels engineered, with outbreaks flaring in winter when fleas should be dormant, or skipping entire regions only to circle back months later like a predator choosing its prey. Then there are the motives. The plague didn't just kill, it redistributed power with brutal efficiency. The church seized lands, kings crushed revolts under pretexts of quarantine, and merchant dynasties rose from the ashes of competitors. The Visconti family's sudden dominance in Milan, the Habsburgs' debt-fueled empire building, these weren't coincidences. They were power plays made possible by chaos. And let's not forget the whispers of barrels left in streets before outbreaks, of physicians fleeing certain cities days before death arrived, of nobles receiving protective tonics while peasants dropped like flies. But skepticism has its own compelling case. For all the oddities, no smoking gun, no parchment signed by a medieval conspirator, no intact vial of manufactured plague has surfaced. Genetic evidence confirms Yersinia pestis in many victims, even if its behavior was atypical. Could the inconsistencies just reflect patchy records from a terrified pre-scientific world? After all, chaos breeds rumors and trauma distorts memory. The poisoned well accusations mirror countless historical scapegoatings from witch hunts to modern anti-vaccine myths. The debate boils down to this: absence of proof isn't proof of absence. We'll never find a 14th century biolab receipt for plague powder. But history's darkest truths often lurk in the gaps: the documents burned, the witnesses silenced, the anomalies shrugged away. Maybe the Black Death was nature's fury amplified by human ignorance, or maybe someone realized that in the right hands, panic could be as lethal as any pathogen. The evidence won't decide for you. It asks you to weigh the impossible against the unthinkable and wonder which frightens you more. So where does this leave us? The Black Death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a riddle wrapped in a mystery sealed with centuries of silence. The anomalies cling like shadows, entire regions spared while neighbors perished, symptoms that don't match bubonic plague, the eerie precision with which power shifted hands in the aftermath. Venetian barrels of powder left in streets before outbreaks, nobles receiving mysterious tonics, while commoners suffocated in their own blood, genetic evidence of bacteria that behaved unnaturally. These aren't just gaps in the record. They're fractures in the story we've been told. Think of the survivors' accounts like Boccaccio's Decameron, where the wealthy seemed to vanish behind gated estates as if they'd been warned. Or the Vatican's locked archives, where an entire section labeled Moore's Day supposedly holds confessions about barrels from the East. Even the earth itself whispers secrets: plague pits laced with arsenic, skeletons with drill holes through their chests, tree rings showing unnatural spikes of sulfur right before the pandemic began. None of this fits the tidy narrative of rats and fleas, and here's the chilling part. If the deadliest pandemic in history could be something other than what we've been taught, what else might be hiding in plain sight? Wars, revolutions, even entire civilizations lost to time. How many were shaped not by chance, but by design? History isn't just written by the victors. It's edited by them. So what do you think really happened in those dark years? Was it a natural disaster twisted by human greed, or something far more deliberate? Drop your wildest theories below, and if you're ready to pull back the curtain on more buried truths, hit that subscribe button. The past isn't done talking. And next time, we might just hear it scream.